Welcome to our next class. So last week we started actually answering questions on a post that was put up on my YouTube channel as I was going through the topic of responding to statements made on the Atheist.org website. And this particular atheist that posted, which I appreciate the cordial manner in which they did and the well-organized thoughts that they had, amounted to a list of 10 facts or reasons why they did not feel that there was enough evidence for them to believe that God exists. So, or any God, as they state. So we have got to number 7 here on the list, and I just want to continue on so that we have enough time. And we ended last week with number 6. So number 7, this is number 7 on the list. Several proposed and generally accepted explanations for observable phenomena that were previously based on the agency of a god or gods have subsequently been replaced with rational, natural explanations, each substantiated with evidence that excluded the agency of a god or gods. I have never encountered vice versa. So this is the position that this person holds. They feel as though in the past that all the observable phenomena obviously must have a natural cause for them. The explanation would be a natural cause as opposed to a supernatural cause. And so that's where they sit and why they have that. And they've never seen it to the contrary. So, in our response, it's true that there are observable phenomena that over time has been discovered to have a natural explanation of its occurrence. I agree. However, this is not conclusive evidence that all phenomena has rational, natural explanations. And notice that I've changed the colors on the words that are used above in number 7. For example, there exists no natural explanation for nature itself. In other words, nature cannot be the original cause of itself. The laws that govern nature do not naturally arise apart from intelligence. So this is something that I know that atheists and theists go back and forth on. But the bottom line is that nature cannot give rise to nature. Nature cannot create nature. It can't account. The effect of nature cannot say that nature is the cause. That's not only violating the law of causality, but it flies in the face of everything that's rational and a natural explanation. It would not fit that category. So if we continue on, much of what we observe and have learned to utilize is epistemological, but answers no ontological questions regarding them. For example, now again, epistemology is the study of how we know what we know. Ontology is the study of the nature of being. In other words, why does something exist in the first place? So, for example, life. No one actually knows what life is. We enjoy it and we use it, but and we recognize it, but nobody actually knows what it is. And to make the assumption that life is arisen from simply natural causes, we never see life coming from rocks. Never. Matter never gives rise to life ever. That's the abiogenesis issue. Thought, love, values, messaging, information, that doesn't come from rocks. That that comes from a mind. That is something that's produced in a person's mind, or ultimately grounded in the mind of God. That's where thought comes from. Again, nobody sees thoughts. We observe the effects of thoughts, and then we work from effect back to cause. And we all know that we have these thoughts. However, there's no evidence that thought comes from any pure material or naturalistic process. In other words, we use our thinking, but the ontological question needs to be asked: where does it actually come from? In other words, somebody had to create our ability to think. Consciousness, the same thing, the ability to communicate, trafficking in non-material aspects. These ideas that we're going back and forth on, well, at least we're going one way, right? This does not result from a purely unguided, blind, materialistic process. Self-knowledge, knowing I'm not someone else, and vice versa. This is basically the law of identity in logic, and this is fundamental to our thinking. Yet, how is it that I even know that? Because I evolved, somehow life sprang from rocks and then ended up, I'm an overly developed animal? No, that doesn't work. That doesn't square with anything. And it certainly is not scientific or rational. So morality and other non-material characteristics such as logic used to construct arguments against God's existence. Let's not forget the existence of the universe itself. All of these fly in the face of a purely materialistic universe. Atheists need to get to the ontological issue without getting stuck in the epistemological morass, because everybody can figure out they know what they know. Look, you can be a great mechanic, work on a car engine, and say, you know what, we don't actually need the Ford motor anymore. I know how this motor works. I can work on it, and I don't need Henry Ford. Well, that's true, but there would be no engine if there was no Henry Ford, and that's the issue. Just because a mechanic is good working on an engine does not mean that you can just eliminate where the engine came from. You can talk all about the engine, but there's an ultimate question. How did it get there in the first place? And that is not answered by a mechanic that is just really good at their job. That doesn't answer that question. That just answers how it works or how they believe that it works. So lacking a good presentation of a sound logical argument does not mean one doesn't exist or that God doesn't exist. I think we need to remember that. So,
what is the philosophical foundations for Christianity?
The philosophical foundations for Christianity.
Yes.
That's kind of a broad question. I'm trying to discover what he means by that. But if you want to say that our ability to even think and reason and come to philosophical conclusions presupposes there's a realm, an immaterial realm of intelligence, the laws of logic, a reality, including the universe, including our existence. So we're reasoning from effect back to cause. That's how we know God exists. We have an effect, we're an effect. Reason is an effect, and we're reasoning back to the cause. At the end of the day, there's only two possibilities. Either mind came from matter, or matter came from mind. Every worldview, you can boil it down to that. Either mind came from matter, or matter came from mind. Well, we know scientifically that matter had a beginning, and so matter is not eternal. We also know that matter is composed. It's put together by it has parts to it, so it's put together by a composer, which means that the ultimate reality is a mind, and that mind is what we mean by God's nature. So I don't know if that's what he was looking for, but that's the direction I would go in.
Thank you.
I think that was a good explanation.
is the best explanation of intentional states of consciousness in the world? Philosophers are puzzled by states of intentionality. Intentionality is the property of being about something or of something. It signifies the object-directedness of our thoughts. For example, I can think about my summer vacation, or I can think of my wife. No physical object has this sort of intentionality. A chair or a stone or a glob of tissue like the brain is not about or of something else. Only mental states or states of consciousness are about other things. As a materialist, Dr. Rosenberg recognizes this fact and so concludes that on atheism, there really are no intentional states. Dr. Rosenberg boldly claims that we never really think about anything. But this seems incredible. Obviously, I am thinking about Dr. Rosenberg's argument. This seems to me to be a reductio ad absurdum of atheism. By contrast, on theism, because God is a mind, it's hardly surprising that there should be finite minds. Thus, intentional states fit comfortably into a theistic worldview. So, we may argue, 1, if God did not exist, intentional states of consciousness would not exist. 2, but intentional states of consciousness do exist. 3, therefore, God exists.
You know, I think that it's important that we recognize that the arguments that Dr. Turek, Dr. Craig are dealing with here deal with consciousness, thinking. These are, I've tried to emphasize this, these are non-material aspects of who we are. And the expectation that they arose simply because you had long periods of time is not scientific. Time does not add intelligence into any process. It actually deteriorates the process. Time does. So, contrary to trying to discover whether somehow materialism can answer that question, it can't. It's just not possible. So let's move on and jump to the next one.
The question of the central Christian claim that Jesus is God become human is, of course, a fascinating one for any scientist, and very frequently people react with a certain amount of incredulity when they discover I believe this, and they say, how could you possibly believe in the 21st century as a scientist that Jesus was God? I remember being asked this once at a large gathering of physicists who'd come to hear me lecture on the relationship of science to theology, and one physicist after the lecture said, how could you possibly believe this? It's all very well talking about the fine-tuning argument and evidence that there's an intelligence behind the universe, but come off it. This is going way beyond to assert that the God who designed the universe and who upholds it actually became human. Can you explain it? And I grinned and said, yes, but I want to ask you a question first. He said, that's fine. I said, my question's much simpler. It's this: what is consciousness? Oh, he said, we don't really know what consciousness is. Well, I said, okay, let's try something simpler and something that comes nearer to the realm of physics. What is energy? And he said, yes, well, energy is something we know a lot about. We can measure it, we can use it, and so on. We can convert it into different forms. I said, but that's not my question. My question is, what is it? He said, well, we don't really know. Well, I said, it's good to hear that, because at least it shows you agree with the Nobel Prize winner for physics, Richard Feynman, who said, nobody knows what energy is. But I said, you believe in these things, and yet you don't know what they are. Should I write you off as a physicist? He said, please don't. I said, of course I won't. But you get my point. I suspect you were about to write me off as an intelligent person because I believed in something which, if it's true, of course, is infinitely more sophisticated and complex than the things that we're just talking about. But it helps us into the whole question, because the reason you believe in consciousness and energy, even though you cannot understand very much about what they actually are, is because of their explanatory power. They make sense of various things that you observe. And I said it's exactly the same, of course, at a deeper or perhaps a higher level with my faith that Jesus is both God and man. It's the only solution that makes sense. That he is a man is not difficult, of course, but it's that he is both God and man. And I believe that that makes sense of the evidence of his life, the uniqueness of his claim, which he backed up by showing that he possessed the attributes of God. And above all, I suppose the central thing that I find convincing is the fact that he rose from the dead. He's broken the death barrier. But of course, to go into those details is a completely separate argument.
Dr. Lennox is definitely a brilliant guy. I greatly appreciate him. And so I think he makes the case of what actually makes sense. So let's move on to number 8 in the list. Number 8 is this atheist says, I have never experienced the presence of a God through intercession of angels, divine revelation, the miraculous act of divinity, or any occurrence of a supernatural event. All right. In response. And that's pretty clear, right? I mean, that kind of doesn't really need explanation. This person has not experienced those things. I would first of all see the response in the first one, in list 1 to 3, those in the first video at the beginning, because that deals with the subjective nature of this. In other words, just because a person doesn't experience anything in particular, that doesn't mean that whatever they don't experience does not exist, right? That's similar to an argument from silence. There's people that I've never met that other people have talked to, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist because I've never met them. I've only heard about them. Regarding divine revelation, in this list above, I mean, look, I've never experienced the intercession of an angel or had a visitation by an angel, or I guess if you would call my coming to faith in Jesus Christ and the work that God did really without my even asking to make changes in my life that were definitely beneficial and pleasing to me. Those may be a miraculous act because it was certainly nothing that I could accomplish on my own. So, but divine revelation, I think, is answerable. So regarding that, the discussion of New Testament manuscripts and all that, I think that provides the evidence of, first of all, in the New Testament, we have an accurate transmission of the documents. Transmission is the communication of them in their copying down through time. Now, people have a tendency to think the Bible is a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. That's really not the case. When they make Bibles, they go back to original source documents. Though we don't have the original autographs, we know that what has been copied has been transmitted out throughout the Judean world in the first century into Asia Minor, over to Europe and all that. But the New Testament, the catalog New Testament manuscripts are nearing about 30,000. There's about 5,800 of which are original language, the Greek manuscripts from what they were originally written in the first century. The other languages are contemporary with many of the Greek manuscripts. In other words, while they were still copying Greek and passing them to different areas throughout the first few hundred years of Christianity, then they were making, Latin copies and Coptic and Nubian and Syrian and many other different languages. And so they were contemporary with the Greek. It wasn't like they had all the Greek manuscripts and then they started to make the others. So there was kind of a branching off. That they obviously went back to the original Greek manuscripts, the copies, that is, to make them. These manuscripts are corroborated by early church fathers for accuracy of transmission. Transmission errors, which are called textual variances, are explained in my 3-part video series called Apologetics, New Testament is Reliable. The accuracy of the New Testament documents is detailed there. And there's a lot of information there. We really can only touch briefly on some of the concepts here, but I just want to make sure that this issue is at least covered. So as we move on, the historical reliability of New Testament manuscripts are valueless unless we know they tell the truth. So we can have accurately transmitted or copied manuscripts, but if they all tell a lie, then that's valueless. They may have been copied well and passed on, but that doesn't mean that what they're saying is true. There are many holy books that claim to tell the truth, but are not able to be questioned. In other words, like the Quran, that's not something that is allowed to be questioned in any way at all within Islam, or make. So if we go back, but are not able to be questioned or make no absolute claims requiring historical verification of the writing. So, we need to be able to go back and follow the transmission of ancient documents in order to validate whether there's any legitimacy to them at all. There are internal and external reasons or evidences why the New Testament documents can be validated as telling the truth. I'll go through a couple of quick headings here. Again, you'd have to go back to the other videos for the detail. Early and abundant manuscript testimony. Of all documents of antiquity, only the New Testament has the copies of the original manuscripts closest to the source documents and more copies to verify the accuracy of transmission. This is out of everything, bar none, in the ancient world. So if we look at this chart real quick, you can see that the New Testament, the time gap in years from the copies, and like I say, there's roughly 5,800 for the New Testament in its original language of Greek. The closeness of the first copies to the originals is probably within 25 years or so. The next closest is Homer. Now, the number of manuscript copies in Homer should be more than that. At this point in time, this chart's a little bit dated, but I think you get the point. As we go down the line, Homer's the closest, but you're talking 500 years out. And then as you get down the list there, we have really nothing close to the original source documents. You're talking, really virtually 1,000 years or more for everything that we have out of ancient history. So the following video clip by Dr. Daniel Wallace and Dr. Craig Bloomberg will give some explanation to this. Dr. Wallace heads up actually the cataloging of all the ancient New Testament manuscripts electronically. So, I mean, he's heading up this massive effort, but they're digitizing everything so that everybody can investigate them and everything else. So he is easily one of the foremost manuscript experts, I think, that we can draw on to find out where we're at with this whole issue.
When you think about the comparison in terms of the number of copies we have for the Gospels versus other ancient documents, I can say in general that the copies we have of the Gospels are far, far more numerous than any other thing we have in the Greco-Roman world, including Homer, which comes in a distant second. And I'm splitting that between the Odyssey and the Iliad. We have, as I've mentioned, about 5,800 manuscripts in Greek of the New Testament. Most of those are going to have Gospels or part of the Gospels in them. Then we have other ancient translations of the New Testament, beginning with Latin in the 2nd century. We have about 10,000 copies of Latin. Again, most of those are of the Gospels, and then they'll have other portions as well. We have Coptic, Syriac, Georgian, Gothic, Old Church Slavonic, Armenian, Arabic, Aramaic, numerous languages, and those languages, not counting the Latin, come to at least 5,000, probably more than 10,000 copies. So when you gather all this material together, for the whole New Testament or portions of the New Testament, we've got at least 20,000 copies of the New Testament in some form of these ancient languages. If you were to wipe all those out, and you had a magic wand, you could just destroy all of them in one fell swoop, we'd still be able to reproduce virtually the entire New Testament just from the writings of the church fathers alone, because they commented on the New Testament and they did not have the gift of brevity. And so these church fathers, we have over 1 million quotations of the church fathers from the New Testament. Once again, the Gospels are the primary things that they quote from. Now, let's compare that to just the average classical author. The average classical Greek or Latin author has fewer than 20 copies of his writings still in existence. Far fewer typically, sometimes 1 or 2. Sometimes we have such massive gaps that somebody will mention, I've written these 35 books and we only have 18 of them, or only 4 of them left in existence. Sometimes we're waiting 1,000 years before we see our earliest copy. But let's say the average classical author has 20 copies, to be on the very generous side. You stack those up, they'll be about 4 feet high. Stack up the New Testament manuscripts in the various languages, not counting the patristic quotations, and the stack would be more than 1 mile high. So the comparison, there is no comparison. It's just a massive disparity. What you're dealing with classical literature is a dearth of evidence. What you're dealing with the New Testament is an embarrassment of riches.
The question of whether we can be confident that we have reconstructed documents extremely close to the originals that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would have originally produced is another place where there's a lot of misinformation in society. Textual critics of all or no theological perspectives agree that with all the New Testament documents, and particularly with the Gospels, we can go back with a high degree of confidence to documents as early as the 2nd century, which may well have been copied directly from the manuscripts that were the first editions, if you like, of the 4 Gospels. And that as these texts emerge, we have larger and larger fragments preserved until, as we move into the 3rd century, we have nearly complete Gospels, and in the 4th and 5th centuries, nearly complete New Testaments. These represent amounts of evidence for which no other document or collection of documents anywhere in the ancient world enjoys. It's a luxury of evidence. And so while none of this proves that what the gospel writers were saying was necessarily all true, it certainly is more than adequate to show we know what their original claims were.
And that's the point. I think the accuracy of transmission is key, but I think there's an abundance of evidence to demonstrate that what they were saying also was truthful. So as we move on, get my mouse to work here. Let's see. Jump in here. All right, so we talked about the early manuscripts and their abundance. So the next thing is verifiable eyewitness testimony. The nature of the writings themselves possess the natural characteristics of eyewitness testimony, such as the mentioning of archaeological and geographical landmarks, existing historical contemporary figures, and historical events known to take place at the time of writing. Those do not lend themselves to myth. Again, the detail is in the other videos that I went through. We see 31 persons mentioned. These are historical persons mentioned in the New Testament. This list is taken from I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Dr. Geisler and Dr. Turek. And I would highly recommend that book, both for Christians and definitely for atheists, because they do a great job in the book of presenting evidence. But these are people that at the time of writing, to add these people in along with the facts of what they were doing, if any amount of that was wrong, they would have been discarded easily. And then there's the rest of them. So that's, you're talking 31 people that are really people that are really outside of the pale of the gospel writers themselves, or the New Testament writers, if you will. They had humiliating testimony, things mentioned about Jesus' followers and of Jesus himself that under a fabricated story would have no value and even tend to detract from the appeal of leaders of a religious group. In other words, if you were going to write a story to try to get people to follow you, half the stuff in the Gospels you'd have to take out, because they show the kind of like the Three Stooges bumbling sometimes of the apostles early on, and then even what people within Jesus' own family thought about him. At one point they thought he was kind of losing his mind and trying to get him to go home. And so these are not flattering things if you're going to write a story that you're going to try to convince everybody to follow you. As a matter of fact, the heroes are the women, which in the first century, they didn't have the full weight of testimony of even a man, but who were the first to arrive at the tomb, the empty tomb? It was the women. And again, that's because when you're writing accurate history, the quality of the writing, or the quality of the historical validation, is seen in the fact that it's just recorded, as opposed to kind of ridiculous fabrications and everybody's a hero, The motive of testimony. In other words, the New Testament writers had no motive to advance their narrative of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth and claim it to the extent of martyrdom. What would be the value of that? If they were going to make money off it, if they were going to get fame off of it, or any of the typical things. When you're going to lose your life, you go, okay, the gig is up, you're right, it was fake, we're done. All right? You certainly don't go to the death. That would be insanity. They received persecution and excommunication from Judaism, which they believe was the true religion carried down from Moses and the prophets. They did not gain from their testimony. In other words, if you're going to present something that you are fabricating, there's got to be some buyback from that. You got to get something from it. I mean, even the charlatans today on television that are reaching into everybody's pocket, a lot of these these money-grabbing false teachers on television or on the internet, whatever, they're gaining something, So they've obviously made religion into a business, and some of them it's big business. But the point is that these guys, these New Testament people, these ladies, they gained nothing but hardship, and many of them lost their lives through it. The testimony of prophetic fulfillment. The New Testament writers and apostles followed Jesus of Nazareth because he fulfilled the anticipated Old Testament predictions of the Messiah with all the miraculous accompaniments of healing, miracles, and raising himself from the dead, which he claimed he would do after 3 days. Pretty good. His enemies, aware of the claim, did everything to prevent the body from being stolen. So, you think about that and you realize, well, wait a minute. They heard that he was going to rise from the dead, or he was claiming he would in 3 days. So they said, hey, the last thing that we can afford is to have somebody steal that body. So they had Pilate put a guard on it. Look, if the bottom line is, if anybody had the body other than the disciples, if Jesus never raised, they would have just revealed it and it would have been end of story. If the disciples had it, they wouldn't have died claiming he raised from the dead. Again, we're back to a problem of motives. All right. They needed to verify prophetic testimony about the Messiah and see the fulfillment. The Old Testament prophecies told us who he would be. He would be human, from Abraham's line and the tribe of Judah. Who he would be God from eternity. Where he would be born, in Bethlehem. There was 2 Bethlehems specifically. This is going to be Bethlehem Ephratah, which was a smaller one near Jerusalem, not the one up in the Galilee area. How he was going to be born, of a virgin, and everybody understands the scandal that Mary was under. Why he was born, to defeat Satan and death, right? And these are all the accompanying verses in the Bible. Why? Because he was the Savior of the world. When? And again, though there's detail on this, I go in on other videos. When Nehemiah received the command from Artaxerxes, that decree to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, Daniel tells us that it was 173,880 days until the Messiah would be killed. And so we have the starting point, the ending point. In Matthew 21, when he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, there's no way that you can anticipate this from history. Daniel prophesied in about 600 BC. So you're talking, 600 years later, this stuff coming to pass. There's nothing that can come close to this. Peter Stoner, in a book called Science Speaks, originally published in 1958, revised in 1976. In Chapter 3, he actually got together with students in his class to go over the possibilities of somebody fulfilling prophecy like Christ. Now, Jesus fulfilled actually hundreds of prophecies his first arrival, and he did this. Stoner calculated the probability of just 8 messianic prophecies being fulfilled in the life of Jesus, this particular Jesus of Nazareth. As you read through these prophecies, you will see that all estimates were calculated as conservatively as possible. Now, this is from Chapter 3 of his book. It's available online. So these are the prophecies that you would have somebody born in Bethlehem. Well, that right away eliminates millions of people because you only have so many people born there. There would be a messenger that prepared his way. He would enter Jerusalem riding on a donkey. That's the one from Matthew 21. Again, prophesied in Zechariah 9:9. Betrayed by a friend. Betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. We're getting pretty specific. The betrayal money was used to buy a potter's field. Now, that was done after Judas killed himself. So after he committed suicide, that's what they used that money for. There was no way for him to have known that. Again, this is all prophesied. He made no defense for himself. Isaiah 53. And the Messiah will die having hands and feet pierced. Psalm 22 gives a pretty detailed account of what is a crucifixion there. Multiplying all these probabilities together produces a number, rounded off, of 1 in 2.8 times 10 to the 28th power. Dividing this number by an estimate of the number of people who lived since the time of these prophecies, which at the time of this writing was about 88 billion, produces a probability of all 8 prophecies being fulfilled accidentally in the life of one person. That probability is 1 in 10 to the 18th power, or 1 with 18 zeros after it. In other words, it's really mathematically impossible. Now, I would just like to add a side note. The mere fact that we can calculate this, talk about probabilities, order, that's because there's a mind behind the universe. This did not arise. I'm not doing this because this arose from matter, and we have to ask where the matter came from in the first place. These prophecies don't include hundreds of other prophecies unrelated to Christ. As we go on, extra-biblical testimony, things outside the Bible, contemporary writings outside the Bible tell the same story that the New Testament manuscripts do, along with archaeological discoveries that confirm the New Testament storyline. There are 10 ancient non-Christian sources, including historians like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thallus, and Phlegon. Government officials, Pliny the Younger, the Emperor Trajan, the Emperor Hadrian, who actually hated the Jews, by the way. Other sources include the Jewish Talmud and the Greek writer Lucian. Compiling their references, these are people outside the Bible, we get the basic New Testament storyline confirmed by non-Christian sources. In other words, when you read the New Testament, obviously you get eyewitness detail and perspective and everything. But these are people that were not involved in the events themselves, but wrote about them. And what we find out, what do they say? They say Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar, that he lived a virtuous life, that he was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. An eclipse and earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome. His disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. This is what the New Testament says without the New Testament. So this is valid, ancient evidence from people's writings outside the Bible. Very, very strong, compelling evidence. If we go on, we have coincidental testimony. What does that mean? Lying just below, and this is a quote from this Professor J.J. Blunt. Well, actually, it's from dealing with his book, but it's a quote taken from Stealing from God by Frank Turek, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. He says, lying just below the surface of the New Testament narrative is an elaborate series of interlocking puzzle pieces that reveal that the New Testament documents contain independent eyewitnesses of actual historical events. Details in one writer's account inadvertently fill in the gaps of another writer's account. I say inadvertently because these details are too subtle, elaborate, and widespread to have been planned or contrived. Cambridge professor J.J. Blunt identified over 60 of these instances in the New Testament alone and called them undesigned coincidences. You can get this book online, this Undesigned Coincidence. You can search for it, and it is at archives.org, and you can just download it and read it if you like. All right. John James Blunt, Undesigned Coincidences, archive.org. All right, number 9. Every phenomenon that I have ever observed has emerged from necessary and sufficient antecedents over time without exception. In other words, I have never observed a phenomenon, entity, process, object, event, process repeated again, substance, system, or being that was created ex nihilo, meaning from nothing, that is instantaneously came into existence by the solitary volition of a deity. Again, it's somewhat subjective to the person. This atheist has never observed that, and I understand exactly what he's saying. There's a lot of things I haven't observed either. I would fit right into that category. However, in response, this would be the expected experience from both atheists and theists alike, right? It's reasonable. Without the clear intervention of a miracle, which by definition is not a common or normally repeated occurrence. The physical laws and goal-directedness of nature enable man to calculate, predict, and develop methods for navigating his environment and aspects of the known universe accessible to him. In other words, this is why the Mars rover hits Mars when we send it up there. Based on the premise of this point, living systems and the universe do not exist, which we know to be false. Why is that? In other words, why do I say that? First of all, true abiogenesis, in other words, life from nothing, has never been observed, though assumed to have arisen by natural processes without evidence. Atheists believe that natural selection somehow did the miracle-working power of bringing it into being. Science has produced nothing in this area. There is zero evidence for abiogenesis. It's actually the evidence against it. It would violate the law of causality without an intelligent designer outside the material system. Nature is not going to give rise to life that doesn't exist in the first place. Like I said, nature can't even create nature. Nature has to come from somebody outside of nature. The design, complexity, information, messaging, etc. have never been observed to have arisen from natural processes. They are believed by evolutionists and atheists to have come from there, but there's no evidence to that. Nobody's ever observed it. Nothing. Zero. Finally, we see the response from questions 4 to 6 for similar reasons. In other words, the law of causality and laws of logic that was discussed in the first video. The last one, number 10, all claims of a supernatural or divine nature that I have encountered have either been refuted to my satisfaction or do not present as falsifiable. In other words, you can't kind of test them out to see, is there some test to be able to put up against them to show that, okay, we can validate this, but we also validate it by how we can falsify, whether it's existence or whatever. And so let's respond to that. Once again, this is a matter of subjective choice, to my satisfaction, obviously, based on the evaluation of objective evidence analyzed to arrive at rational conclusions. However, putting God to a falsifiable test would be impossible by the very nature of his being. Think about that. He's not reducible to an experiment to put under a microscope or direct physical observation, but neither is love, logic, philosophical ideas, or any other non-material aspects of humans. Yet these aspects are believed and used to refute and falsify because they are known by their effects. Trying to falsify God is a category error. He's not in a category that you can put him under a microscope. And though, we talk about philosophically falsifying certain things, there's no way. I mean, you can easily, you can take certain ideas to falsify them, but I think it's going to be difficult to put God into the place where you would want to put him in order to satisfy what you're perspectives are regarding his existence from an atheist perspective. Now, in the continued response, I wanted to put a note down on doubt and a little excursus on morality. I think it's important at this point because undergirding number 10, I believe, is doubt, which is, in principle, is like the reasonable doubt argument in a murder trial. In a murder trial, the defense must only create a reasonable doubt to get their client off the hook for murder. They don't have to prove contrary evidence for every aspect of evidence presented by the prosecution. Atheists at times argue that if there is any reasonable doubt for theism due to any area of scientific investigation, which is obviously limited, or logical analysis, many arguments are not well developed, however. Their atheism remains intact and a theistic God is safely set aside. Now, the reason I say that is because oftentimes it's been thrown to me that from an atheistic perspective, it's like, well, this causes me to doubt this like one thing. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you got this, this just huge list of evidences. And then all of a sudden it's like there's one thing that hangs a person up. That's kind of like getting a jury to have reasonable doubt. That doesn't mean that the person didn't commit the murder. It's just that they could convince the jury because the jury has to be 100% convinced that the person did the murder. But if there's any reasonable doubt that the person did not commit the murder, they can't vote to convict them. So anyways, however, halfway through here, putting atheism to the same test of reasonable doubt would eliminate it as a valid position. I think a lot of times atheists they exempt themselves from the criteria that they're placing on theists. Well, the same has to be put back on their own position. That's only reasonable and valid. Reasonable doubt does not eliminate God, nor does it validate atheism. Sometimes doubts are used as logical arguments when they are not. They're not actual arguments. Sometimes skeptics remain skeptical of everything but their own skepticism. The point is, reasonable doubt does not answer the question as to whether or not God exists. Atheists and theists can all have doubts on both sides, for we don't know enough to have all answers. We must logically conclude the truth from the evidence, obviously, that we have, and the opposite of what is true will always be false. There's no way to avoid that. Regarding the existence of absolute truth, since I mentioned truth, innate logical thinking, which we would certainly ground in the law of non-contradiction, that two things can't be opposite and true at the same time in the same sense, and arguing based on these simple but foundational aspects of our existence, these are not possible in an atheistic worldview. It is not possible to have this kind of logical thinking if God does not exist. If truth is not absolute, key point, there is no learning, and the development of logical arguments are a deceptive fantasy. Truth has to be absolute in order to do anything. However, we cannot argue against absolute truth without affirming it, and we cannot deny the law of non-contradiction without affirming that. Lacking the understanding of these most basic concepts of truth and thinking, discussion on anything becomes valueless. So if you want to know more about this concept, my apologetics class, parts 1 to 3, The Truth is Knowable, answers and goes into detail on this particular subject. But the truth is knowable. If truth is not absolute, I know that atheists constantly say it's relative. But to say that truth is relative is making an absolute statement. They're contradicting themselves. It's a self-stultifying statement. They're shooting themselves when they aim the gun at somebody else. And the problem is that many times they just don't realize that. It's very simple and straightforward, but and look, many people can do that. I'm not just saying atheists do it, but when they try to argue, anybody that tries to argue for relativism is affirming the law of non-contradiction because they're saying something other than relativism is not relativism, right? And they're making an absolute statement that relativism is true and something else is not. I mean, they're using non-contradiction and the absolute nature of truth in order to say that it doesn't exist. That's my point. The reason this is so essential to understand is that there would be nothing to ground the absolute nature of truth in without a theistic God. To support atheism by arguing truth is relative affirms both non-contradiction and absolute truth, since both are used to argue against each. Atheists tend to argue that truth is relative because they realize that in a purely materialistic universe, there is no external referent to ground truth in outside of the material universe. Thus, the only alternative is relativism. If God does not exist, you're right, there is no truth. There's nothing. Okay? I don't even know if the thoughts that I'm thinking or communicating to you are just the reaction of chemicals in my brain. Okay? That's where we go with this. So, but we know that that's not our experience. We know that that's not correct. So, we need to have truth grounded somewhere other than in my own personal perspective. Otherwise, we get almost 8 billion different truths, little kind of personal, truth and reality domains out there. And we know that that's not true. We would get nowhere. You couldn't learn anything if there was no truth. You couldn't function. I'll give you an example. But is relativism in truth or morality reasonable? No, it's not. It is a self-contradictory philosophy. Since the truth is knowable, and what is opposite of what is true is false, the only framework in which this is even possible is a theistic worldview. Why? Theism provides the external referent in God's nature to ground truth, logic, and morality. Atheists may appeal to the Euthyphro dilemma, which is, in other words, is something good, meaning moral, because God says it is good, or God says it is good because it is good in itself. Those are the options in this Euthyphro dilemma that's often brought up. But this is valueless since it is based on the fallacy of false alternatives or false conclusion. In other words, you don't have enough options. You're only given those two. However, goodness or morality is grounded in the nature of God and expressed in his commands and laws. This alternative is not offered by Socrates in the question posed to Euthyphro. So in that whole Euthyphro dilemma, I've heard Michael Shermer throw it out and others, and it's like, come on. This is ridiculous. You have two alternatives that are given, and just because of that, like all of a sudden we have a conclusive answer. I don't think so. Reality is grounded in God, and these aspects of truth, logic, morality are founded in his nature. Thus, truth and morality are absolute. Relativistic schemes such as cultural relativism, conventionalism, ethical subjectivism all fail logically and practically, but atheists argue for them epistemologically repeatedly and must be examined. Remember, I talked about the epistemological morass we get into. So a brief overview to show the fallacy of these schemes is on the next slide. First, cultural relativism. That is, different cultures have different values, thus there is no objective absolute morality. In other words, no actual truth exists. So that's kind of the cultural relativism. This culture does it one way, that culture does it a different way. So see, there's no real truth. That's the idea behind it. Response: this is nothing more than observation or sociology. Morality is prescriptive and carries an obligation to observe. Sociology is descriptive and only describes what is observed. Declaring no absolute truth exists is an absolute truth claim, like I just explained earlier. You can look at different cultures, but you're just describing what they do. That's sociology. That's descriptive. Morality is prescriptive. It has oughtness to it. This is what you ought to do, which is why we say one thing is right morally or one thing is wrong morally. You don't get right or wrong from sociology. You just get a description of what people are doing. Conventionalism. This says societies define what is right or wrong, in other words, for them. Morality is equal to what is legal. They make certain things legal in different societies. Truth is defined by majority vote or who has the power, because they're the ones that make the laws, and then those laws say this is right, that's wrong, and that's where morality fits in, and then it becomes the conventions that they live by. Response. First, attempting to change this kind of society based on conventionalism, in other words, that what they vote in is right or wrong or what they command by power, to try to change that society would be considered immoral, since you're going against the majority or who is in power, contradicts the societal truth. Rebellion in this society would reveal absolute morality, since a new moral standing declares the societal position to be immoral. This is a classic self-contradiction. The reason conventionalism does not work, and it does not even philosophically work, and again, it's self-defeating, is because if you say that, well, look, that's what everybody does there, and that's right for them. Well, if somebody ever decides, hey, you know what, we want to do it differently. No, you can't do that. You can't do that because you don't have majority or you don't have power. But if you rebel against it to change it, you say, no, but we're going to change it for the better. Oh, no. No, that is defined as wrong based on a conventional view of truth. That's the problem with it. People don't work through this stuff. How about ethical subjectivism? In other words, what is true for one person is not true for another. What's true for you is not true for me, the idea. Right and wrong are subjective and personal. Everyone possesses their own truth. So I have my own truth. It's true for me, and everybody's got their own truth. I mean, look, that's ridiculous. But in response, right and wrong in this view is meaningless, obviously, because there is no right and wrong if everybody has their own truth. Truth is nothing more than opinion, and therefore nothing could be ever considered right or wrong, including removing all the rights of ethical subjectivists, which they would declare wrong. In other words, if a society said, hey, everybody that thinks that ethical subjectivism is wrong, in other words, that everybody has their own truth, we're going to take your rights away. They'd say, whoa, you don't have a right to do that. Well, but that's true for us. That may not be true for you, but it's true for us. You see how that doesn't work? It doesn't work in any practicality, and it doesn't work logically. This philosophy is not lived out even by those who adhere to its tenets, for if they go to get money out of their bank account, what may be true for them, $100 in the account, may not be true for the bank teller. They say, no, you only have $2 in the account. What do you mean? I just put $100 in the other day. Well, that may be true for you, but not for me. You see, it doesn't work. It's not rational. Nothing of the sort in this kind of thinking is rational. No one lives by this construct. They only argue against it, but use it and affirm it by doing it in the process. So they affirm the truth by trying to argue it, but they don't always realize it. I think it was important just that we understand those pieces. The bottom line question, does the existence of an infinite being better answer ultimate reality by working from effect back to cause, or does nothing answer ultimate reality? If we use everything we know to be true in scientific investigation, which requires philosophy in order to do science, in other words, before you put anything under the microscope, you got to be thinking about it and reason it out, and reasonably follow inference to the best explanation. In other words, I'm the police detective. I go into the house. This guy is stabbed in the heart 3 times with 3 different knives. Well, inference to the best explanation, he didn't commit suicide. So obviously, any one of the 3 would have killed him. He wouldn't have been able to put the other 2 in, you know. So anyways, inference to the best explanation, I believe, is assumed by the premise of the 10 questions that I've been answering. So that is the best way to answer ultimate reality. God's existence is the only tenable position. I believe that's the only logical and reasonable position to have. Number 3, the actual burden of proof is on atheism to somehow give an answer to the existence of the material universe, number 1, and all non-material aspects of life and consciousness, which are evident to even a non-scientific observer, again, only possible in a theistic worldview. Atheism doesn't pass the smell test, or any test for that matter. No pun on the word matter. But the point that I want to make is, look, I think the burden of proof is on atheism. I understand atheists feel the burden of proof is on theists, but atheists do not have this position that needs to be unseated, though they think they do. But they don't, because there's nothing rational about their position. They think adding God, because there's a supernatural aspect to it, or extraordinary or extraordinary claim that's being made, that, you're making an extraordinary claim, you got to have proof. Well, usually they're asking for extraordinary proof, which is, so for that miracle, you need to give me another miraculous. Well, we don't believe in miracles, so it's like, where do I go? But be that as it may, I think that the burden of proof is on atheism, because I think that is the abnormal position, because it does not answer for the basic existence of the universe and non-material aspects of life and consciousness that we've been talking about. Finally, logically and scientifically, a theistic God is the only reasonable starting place for the universe, life, and this presentation to make any sense at all. So we're going to have 2 quick videos that follow here, and so I'll comment after we get done with those.
I believe that God's existence best explains a wide range of the data of human experience. Let me just mention 8. First, God is the best explanation of why anything at all exists. Suppose you were hiking through the forest and came upon a ball lying on the ground. You would naturally wonder how it came to be there. If your hiking buddy said to you, "Just forget about it, it just exists inexplicably," you would think either that he was joking or that he wanted you to just keep moving. No one would take seriously the idea that the ball just exists without any explanation. Now, notice that merely increasing the size of the ball, even until it becomes coextensive with the universe, does nothing to provide or remove the need for an explanation of its existence. So, what is the explanation of the existence of the universe? Whereby the universe, I mean all of space-time reality. The explanation of the universe can lie only in a transcendent reality, beyond the universe, beyond space and time, which is metaphysically necessary in its existence. Now, there's only one way I can think of to get a contingent universe from a necessarily existing cause, and that is if the cause is a personal agent who can freely choose to create a contingent reality. It therefore follows that the best explanation of the existence of the contingent universe is a transcendent personal being, which is what everybody means by God. We can summarize this reasoning as follows. 1, every contingent thing has an explanation of its existence. 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is a transcendent personal being. 3. The universe is a contingent thing. 4. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence. 5. Therefore, the explanation of the universe is a transcendent personal being, which is what everybody means by God.
Sorry about that. I thought I had 2 videos there. I had 1. I think, again, Dr. Craig really hits the point, because ultimately you have to have God. So, my own final thoughts here that I'll leave with you, because I know I've gone beyond the hour. Number 1, the law of causality cannot be circumvented to conveniently eliminate an uncaused first cause for the universe, life, and non-material aspects. It is unscientific and irrational to examine the universe and living systems using the law of causality and then abandon it because it does not meet with the preconceived ideas of atheistic materialism. Number 2, many atheists argue strongly against a beginning of the universe from nothing, but the existence of time and laws which make the universe comprehensible and logical are never observed to arise from nothing. A quantum vacuum is something. I know Lawrence Krauss, his book, A Universe from Nothing, his nothing is a quantum vacuum, but I think Aristotle said it better. Nothing is what rocks dream about. That is nothing. It is no thing. So even you have to have something to create the quantum vacuum because it is something. Many atheists, number 3, work very hard to eliminate consciousness and free will because of the monkey wrench it throws into the atheistic mechanism, however, without evidence, especially where they consciously and freely develop philosophical ideas against the theistic God, stealing the theistic worldview in the process to argue theism. So, anyways, I think that certainly, there is a little bit of a contradiction here and an irony as they do that. Number 4, atheists notoriously argue epistemologically, I mentioned that, and not ontologically. Though the issue of absolute morality was not fully developed in this presentation, many atheists attempt to construct an elaborate series of asserted claims of how morality developed from dead matter. What is seemingly overlooked consistently is that morality is prescriptive, what we ought to do, requiring an external referent, and not descriptive, what people do, which is sociology. The same faulty method of reasoning is used when many atheists try and argue for what we know scientifically instead of how it all came to be. Arguing after the fact proves nothing. Darwin can talk about finches all day long and their beak sizes. At the end of the day, they're finches. Scientists can talk about bacteria that alters and everything. These are mutations within a living system. They are not changes from one thing to another. We know that. Next, the final sentence on this particular atheist post said this: "It is natural, rational, and prudent to be skeptical of unsubstantiated claims, especially extraordinary ones." I agree, but the extraordinary or supernatural really is what that's implying. Claim that must be answered is atheism, not theism. Assuming nature, natural selection, materialism, gave rise to itself and various non-material aspects already discussed, pleads a natural selection of the gaps and looks to it as a miracle worker to produce what no unguided material process has ever resulted in. It is wishful thinking at best, but not science nor natural and rational. Thus, I am prudently skeptical. So I would basically use the terms of the atheists that put the post in. I'm skeptical in the opposite way. Number 6, proving and persuading are different. I may not be able to persuade atheists that God exists, but that may be because they don't want to be persuaded, no matter what proofs I provide. If I don't present a good argument for God's existence, that does not mean that there is not one. I'm certainly not the end-all, be-all. No one can compel anyone to believe anything by any amount of good evidence that in fact proves a position if they are not willing to accept the evidence offered. The lack of acknowledgement of God's existence is a psychological state, and that's kind of where I sense that the atheist that gave the post is coming from. But that's not a scientific position. Christians, even, aside from the atheists, Christians who lose their faith or say, I've lost my faith. I used to be a Christian. I've lost my faith. I mean, this is basically Michael Shermer, right? They change no facts of the resurrection of Christ or truths of Christianity. It only shows a change in psychological state of the person. Psychological states are personal and subjective, unrelated to the facts of evidence, especially in the discussion on atheism and theism. Look, if a person says, hey, I'm sorry, I used to believe in God, but I don't believe in God anymore because they went through some issue or, they didn't get a prayer answered or whatever that is, well, that's fine. People can believe what they want to believe. That's not the point. The point is that doesn't change Christianity. That doesn't change the fact that there is good evidence for the resurrection. There is good evidence for the Bible. There's good evidence for God and for, the universe as we understand it. None of that changes that. It just becomes the psychological state of the person deciding they want to view things differently. Next, number 7. I am appreciative of the posts on my YouTube channel of this particular atheist. I do thank you for that. I'm answering and the cordial nature of all the communication between us. Seriously, I just want to say thank you because you were kind in your posts, you were genuine, and I just, I hope that I hope I did a good job on your points. Because I do understand that's where you're coming from. And though we don't agree, that doesn't mean that, I'll say it here. Though we don't agree on the subject of God's existence, I do appreciate the thoughtful and organized list provided. I hope I presented your position to your satisfaction. I don't know if I did. I tried to be honest and fair with your list. I had to guess somewhat in certain areas what you might have been thinking. And that was when I did, I made the guess and I said, I think that's what is being the position that's being put out at that point. For any Christians that have viewed this presentation, I hope that you understand both the atheistic perspective and our own theistic perspective as well in a more defined and understandable way. I hope that is the case. When discussing the topic with atheists, knowing their perspective is key to a meaningful conversation and exchange of ideas. I think a lot of times I have seen some of these discussions get pretty heated, and it's really not necessary. We don't have to be mad because somebody has a different view. Look, I believe that Jesus died, rose again from the dead. I believe that if we believe in him, as the New Testament tells us, that we will have eternal life, that we will move into a whole different state at death and everything else, and that there is a benefit in this life to believing in him now because he provides power and all that. Now, I understand that's subjective to me. I've experienced that. There's no way for me to tell you other than for you to watch the evidence of my life, people that knew me before I was a Christian and people that know me now. However, that's the goal. The goal is not just to win the argument, it's to win the person. And look, from a Christian standpoint, I'm not doing this because I have nothing else to do. I believe there are good reasons to believe in Jesus Christ. Ultimately, I believe that the evidence tells us of God's existence, as I've shared in this video presentation. And so the goal is to convince and bring people to faith in Jesus Christ, because I believe that ultimately that is the reality that we are all yearning for anyways. But I also believe objectively that that truth is there. Finally, I guess I have my 10 too. Finally, for any atheist that stayed with me to hear this conclusion, thank you for your patience. I really appreciate it. It can be very difficult to listen to someone you disagree with and be unable to rebut points as they're made. I hear you. I understand all that. I would only ask that you take an honest look at what I presented and not just dismiss it. That would not be reasonable. The reasonable thing to do, I hope you would agree. Please consider the ontological issue, please. Behind all the topics presented, it is not how you know what you know, but why they exist in the first place. In other words, why do we even have proof of anything, including the resurrection of Christ? Great question. Why are there proofs? These are great questions that deserve good answers, which I believe are there. But anyways, this is the end of part 2. Part 1 covered the first 6 in the list of reasons and were addressed last week. So I'd like to say thank you for watching. And again, I apologize for the length of the video. I know it's over an hour, but if you have any questions, if you want to post anything or send me an email, I will do my best to answer it. And may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.